She was only 5 years old when she heard a piano for the first time. It was a Sunday morning, and her mother had taken her to the small church at the end of their street. The building was old, the paint was peeling, and the wooden benches creaked every time someone moved. But none of that mattered to her, because in the corner of that church, there was something that caught her eyes and never let go. It was an old upright piano, dark brown with chips on the edges and keys that had turned yellow with age. The church lady was playing a simple hymn, nothing fancy, nothing complicated. But to that little girl standing in the doorway, it sounded like magic. She stood frozen, watching those fingers move across the keys, watching how one person could create something so beautiful with just their hands. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment she fell in love. Her family did not have much money. Actually, they had almost nothing. Her father had left before she was born, and her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. They lived in a small apartment on the bad side of town, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors fighting through the walls and where the hallway always smelled like cigarette smoke. There was no piano in their home. There was no music at all, really. Just the sound of her mother coming home tired, the sound of bills being opened with a sigh, and the sound of a television that stayed on all night because the silence felt too heavy. But every Sunday, she would go back to that church. Not because she was religious, but because of that piano. She would sit in the back row and wait for the service to end. Then, when everyone else had gone home, she would walk up to that old instrument and just stare at it. The church lady noticed her after a few weeks. She was a kind woman with gray hair and gentle hands, and she saw something in that little girl's eyes that she recognized. It was hunger. Not for food, but for something deeper. So one day, she asked if the girl wanted to try playing. The girl nodded so fast, she almost hurt her neck. That first touch of the keys was something she would never forget. The sound that came out was not beautiful. It was clumsy and wrong, and made the church lady laugh softly. But it did not matter, because in that moment, she felt something wake up inside her chest. It was like finding a part of herself that she never knew was missing. From that day on, she came to the church every single day after school. The church lady taught her the basics, just simple things like where to put her fingers and how to read the notes. But most of what she learned, she taught herself. She would sit at that piano for hours, trying to copy the songs she heard on the radio, trying to figure out how to make her hands do what her heart was feeling. Her mother did not understand this obsession. She was too tired to understand much of anything. She would come home from work and find her daughter humming melodies, tapping rhythms on the kitchen table, lost in a world that had no place for things like rent and groceries. Sometimes she would get frustrated and tell her to focus on school, to think about getting a real job someday. But the girl could not stop. Music was not a choice for her. It was air. It was the only thing that made sense in a life that often felt like chaos. The years passed slowly in that small town. She went to school, got decent grades, kept her head down. She did not have many friends. Other kids thought she was strange, always lost in her own thoughts, always tapping her fingers like she was playing invisible keys. She did not mind being alone. She had her music, and that was enough. Every night, she would dream about playing on big stages, about audiences standing up and clapping, about a life that was bigger and brighter than anything her town could offer. Those dreams kept her going through the hard days, through the times when there was not enough food, through the nights when she could hear her mother crying in the next room. When she turned 16, the church lady passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack in her sleep, and the girl felt like she had lost the only person who truly understood her. She went to the funeral and sat in the front row, staring at that old piano that now felt empty and cold. After the service, the church decided to get rid of the piano. It was too old, they said. Too broken to be worth fixing. The girl begged them to let her have it. She had no money to offer, nothing to trade, but she begged anyway, with tears in her eyes and desperation in her voice. Maybe they felt sorry for her. Maybe they just wanted it gone. Either way, they said yes. Getting that piano into her tiny apartment was a nightmare. It took 4 neighbors and a lot of sweat, and her mother was furious about the space it took up. But the girl did not care. She finally had her own piano. It was broken and out of tune and missing 2 keys that she had to work around. But it was hers. She played it every single day, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning, until the neighbors banged on the walls and told her to stop. She learned to play softer then, to press the keys gently so the sound would not carry. But she never stopped playing. She could not. By the time she turned 18, she had taught herself more than most students learn in years of formal training. She could play classical pieces, jazz standards, pop songs, anything she heard. Her technique was not perfect. She knew that. She had watched videos of real pianists online, and she could see that her hands moved differently, that she had developed habits that teachers would probably hate. But she also knew that she had something special. When she played, people stopped what they were doing and listened. There was something in her music that touched people, something raw and real that you cannot learn from a book. One night, while scrolling through the internet on an old laptop, she found something that made her heart stop. It was the website for Berklee College of Music in Boston. She had heard of it before, of course. Everyone who loved music knew about Berklee. It was one of the best music schools in the entire world. The place where legends had studied, where dreams came true. She spent hours reading about the programs, the teachers, the opportunities, and somewhere in the middle of the night, with the glow of the screen lighting up her face, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She was going to apply. Her mother thought she was crazy. Berklee was expensive, competitive, and thousands of miles away. Girls like her did not go to places like that. But she did not listen. She spent months preparing her audition tape, recording herself on her phone in the middle of the night when the world was quiet. She wrote her application essay about the church piano, about the church lady, about learning to find beauty in broken things. And then she waited. Weeks turned into months, and every day felt like torture. Until one afternoon, when she came home from her part-time job and found an envelope waiting on the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely open it. But when she finally read those words, when she finally saw that she had been accepted, she fell to her knees and cried. She was going to Berklee. Her life was finally about to begin. The bus ride to Boston took 14 hours. She sat by the window with her 2 suitcases, stuffed in the compartment above her head, watching the world change outside the glass. The small towns gave way to bigger cities. The flat roads turned into highways. And somewhere along the way, she realized she had never been this far from home in her entire life. Her mother had cried at the bus station, holding her tight and whispering that she was proud of her. It was the first time she had heard those words. She held on to them like a treasure, replaying them in her mind as the miles disappeared behind her. When she finally arrived in Boston, the city overwhelmed her. Everything was so big, so loud, so fast. People walked like they were late for something important, their faces buried in phones, their eyes avoiding contact. She dragged her suitcases through the streets, following the directions she had printed out at the library back home. And then she saw it. Berklee College of Music. The building stood tall and proud, covered in glass and filled with the sound of instruments drifting through open windows. She stood on the sidewalk and just stared, feeling tears burn in her eyes. She had made it. After everything, she had actually made it. The first week was a blur of orientation sessions, paperwork, and trying to figure out where everything was. Her dorm room was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but she did not care. She was surrounded by musicians. Real musicians. People who had been trained since childhood, who had private teachers and expensive instruments, and parents who understood their dreams. She listened to them talk about their backgrounds, about the concerts they had performed and the competitions they had won, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach. These people were different from her. They spoke a language she did not fully understand, used terms she had never heard, played with a confidence she had never felt. But she pushed those feelings down and told herself to focus. She was here to learn, to get better, to prove that a girl from nowhere could make it in a world like this. Her classes were hard, harder than anything she had ever done. Music theory, ear training, ensemble work, and of course, piano. She practiced every spare moment she had, staying late in the practice rooms until security told her to leave. She wanted so badly to catch up, to show everyone that she belonged here. And for a little while, she believed she was doing okay. Then came the day that changed everything. It was 3 weeks into the semester, and she had been scheduled for a private assessment with one of the most respected piano professors at Berklee. Everyone talked about this man like he was a legend. His former students had won Grammy Awards, performed at the biggest venues in the world, signed record deals that most musicians only dreamed about. Getting his approval meant something. It meant you had a future in this industry. She prepared for days, practicing the piece she had chosen until her fingers ached and her back was stiff from sitting so long. The assessment room was small and plain, just a piano, 2 chairs, and a window that let in gray afternoon light. He was already there when she walked in, sitting in the corner with a folder in his lap and glasses pushed up on his forehead. He did not smile. He did not say hello. He just nodded toward the piano and said one word: play. She sat down, took a deep breath, and tried to calm her shaking hands. Then she began. She played the way she always played, with everything she had, pouring her heart into every note. She forgot about the room, forgot about the man watching her, forgot about everything except the music flowing through her fingers. 4 minutes. That was how long she played before he held up his hand and said, "Stop." She froze, her fingers hovering over the keys, confusion flooding her chest. She looked at him, waiting for some kind of feedback, some kind of guidance. What she got instead was something she was not prepared for. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes like he was tired. Then he spoke, and his words cut through her like broken glass. He told her that her technique was fundamentally flawed. He said she had developed bad habits that would take years to undo, if they could be undone at all. He said her hand position was wrong, her posture was wrong, her approach to the keys was wrong. Everything she had taught herself, everything she had worked so hard to build, was wrong. She sat there in silence, feeling the room spin around her, feeling her dreams crumble like sand. And then he delivered the final blow. He closed her folder, looked her straight in the eyes, and said words she would never forget. "You will never play piano. Not professionally. Not at this level. I suggest you consider a different instrument. Or maybe a different career entirely." She does not remember leaving the room. She does not remember walking back to her dorm or climbing the stairs or closing the door behind her. The next thing she knew, she was sitting on her bed in the dark, staring at the wall, feeling absolutely nothing. It was like someone had reached inside her chest and pulled out everything that made her who she was. The girl who had fallen in love with an old church piano. The girl who had practiced until 3 in the morning. The girl who had believed so hard that she could make it. That girl was gone. In her place was just an empty shell, hollow and cold. The days that followed were the darkest of her life. She stopped going to classes. She stopped eating. She stopped talking to the few friends she had made. She would lie in bed for hours, replaying his words over and over, wondering how she had been so stupid to think she belonged here. All those years of practice, all those nights of dreaming. And for what? A man had listened to her play for 4 minutes and decided she was worthless. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been fooling herself all along. Her mother called every day, asking how things were going, and she lied every time. She said everything was great, that she was learning so much, that she loved it here. She could not bear to tell the truth. She could not bear to hear the disappointment in her mother's voice, to admit that she had failed before she even really started. So she kept lying, kept pretending, kept sinking deeper into a hole she did not know how to climb out of. 1 month after that assessment, she made a decision. She packed her bags, withdrew from her classes, and bought a bus ticket home. She did not say goodbye to anyone. She did not explain why she was leaving. She just disappeared, like she had never been there at all. She watched the same cities pass by in reverse, the same roads unwind behind her, and she felt like she was traveling backward in time. Back to the small town, back to the tiny apartment, back to a life where dreams were just things that happened to other people. Her mother was shocked when she walked through the door. She asked 100 questions, demanded to know what happened, but the girl could not answer. She could not find the words to explain something so painful, so she just said it did not work out and locked herself in her room. The piano from the church was still there, sitting in the corner, waiting for her, but she could not look at it. She could not touch it. Every time she saw those keys, she heard his voice telling her she would never be good enough. So she found an old blanket and covered it up, hiding it from sight, burying it like something that had died. And in a way, something had. The dream that had kept her alive for so long was finally gone. 5 years. That is how long she spent trying to forget who she used to be. 5 years of waking up every morning and pushing down the ache in her chest. 5 years of pretending that music had never mattered to her, that the piano in the corner was just a piece of furniture, that the dreams she once had were nothing but childhood fantasies. She got very good at pretending. So good that sometimes she almost believed it herself. She took whatever job she could find. She worked as a waitress at a diner, where the coffee was always burned and the tips were never enough. She worked as a receptionist at a dentist office, answering phones and scheduling appointments for people who barely looked at her. She walked dogs for rich families who lived in the nice part of town, picking up after their pets and smiling when they handed her crumpled bills. None of these jobs meant anything to her. They were just ways to pay rent, ways to fill the hours, ways to keep herself so busy that she did not have time to think about what she had lost. Her mother never asked about Berklee again. Maybe she understood that some wounds were too deep to talk about. Or maybe she was just relieved to have her daughter home, safe and close. Even if that daughter seemed like a different person now. They lived together in that same small apartment, moving around each other like strangers, filling the silence with television noise and small talk about weather and groceries. The piano stayed covered in the corner, dust collected on the blanket. Sometimes her mother would glance at it with sad eyes, but she never said a word. The girl who had once dreamed of concert halls now dreamed of nothing at all. She went through her days like a ghost, doing what needed to be done, saying what needed to be said, but never really feeling anything. Her coworkers thought she was quiet. Her neighbors thought she was shy. Nobody knew that inside her chest there was an emptiness so big it scared her sometimes. She had built her entire identity around music, and without it, she did not know who she was supposed to be. But late at night, when the apartment was dark and her mother was asleep, something strange would happen. She would find herself standing in front of that covered piano, her hand reaching out toward the blanket. She never pulled it off. She never let herself go that far. But she would stand there for minutes at a time, feeling the pull of something she could not name. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would press her palm against the blanket and feel the solid shape of the keys underneath. Then she would pull away and go back to bed, telling herself it meant nothing. One evening, everything changed. It was a cold night in early winter, and she had just finished a double shift at the diner. Her feet hurt, her back ached, and she felt more tired than usual. Instead of going straight home, she decided to walk for a while, hoping the cold air would clear her head. She wandered through streets she did not normally visit, past closed shops and empty sidewalks, until she heard something that made her stop. It was music. piano music, coming from a small jazz club tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. She stood outside the door, listening. The melody was unlike anything she had ever heard. It was sad and beautiful and free, like someone was telling a story without words. Before she knew what she was doing, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The club was tiny and dim, with mismatched chairs and candles flickering on the tables. Only a handful of people sat scattered around the room, their faces soft in the low light. And there, on a small stage in the corner, was the source of the music. He was an older man, maybe 60 or 70, with gray hair and dark glasses covering his eyes. His fingers moved across the keys like water flowing over stones, effortless and natural. She realized after a moment that he was blind. He could not see the piano, could not see his hands, could not see anything at all. And yet, he played with more feeling than anyone she had ever witnessed. She found an empty chair and sat down, unable to move, unable to breathe, completely lost in what she was hearing. When the song ended, the small audience clapped softly. The old man smiled and nodded, then announced he was taking a short break. She watched him carefully step down from the stage, guided by instinct and memory, and make his way toward the bar. Something inside her chest was screaming. It was the part of her she had buried for 5 years, the part that loved music more than anything, the part she thought had died in that assessment room at Berklee. Before she could stop herself, she was walking toward him. She did not know what to say. She stood there like a fool, opening her mouth and closing it again, feeling tears build up behind her eyes. Finally, she managed to speak. She told him his playing was beautiful. He thanked her with a gentle voice. And then, without planning to, without understanding why, she told him everything. The words poured out of her like a dam breaking. She told him about the church piano and the old lady who taught her. She told him about Berklee and the professor and the 4 minutes that destroyed her. She told him about the 5 years of silence, the covered piano, the emptiness that never went away. She told him things she had never told anyone, not even her mother. And he listened. He just listened, his blind eyes facing her direction, his expression calm and kind. When she finished, she felt embarrassed. She apologized for talking so much, for dumping her problems on a stranger. But he shook his head slowly and said something that hit her harder than any insult ever could. He said that he could hear the music in her voice. Even when she was just speaking, he could hear the rhythm, the melody, the way her words rose and fell like notes on a page. He said that kind of music does not die. It just goes into hiding sometimes, waiting for permission to come back out. She started crying then, right there in that tiny jazz club, tears streaming down her face while strangers pretended not to notice. He reached out and found her hand, holding it gently. Then he said something that changed her life for the second time. He told her that technique was just a cage that teachers built around students to make them feel small. Emotion was the key that opened everything. That professor at Berklee had taught her how to fail. Now, if she was willing, he would teach her how to feel. She did not understand what he meant. She asked him why he would help her, a stranger with no money and no hope. He smiled at that, a sad and knowing smile. He told her that someone had once done the same for him, a long time ago, when he lost his sight and thought his life was over. Music had saved him, and he had spent every year since then trying to pass that gift along. She was not the first broken musician to wander into his club. She would not be the last. But something about her story told him she was ready. She walked home that night feeling something she had not felt in 5 years. It was small and fragile, like a candle flame in a dark room. But it was there. Hope, the tiniest flicker of hope that maybe her story was not over yet. When she got back to the apartment, she stood in front of the piano for a long time. Her mother was asleep. The building was quiet. Slowly, carefully, she reached down and pulled off the blanket. The piano looked exactly the same as she remembered. Old and chipped and missing two keys. She sat down on the bench and placed her fingers on the cold ivory. Then, for the first time in 5 years, she began to play. She went back to that jazz club the very next evening. And the evening after that. And every evening, for the next 3 months. The old man was always there, sitting at his piano, playing songs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world. She would take a seat in the back and listen, studying every note, every pause, every breath he took between phrases. Sometimes, they would talk during his breaks. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence. He never rushed her. He never pushed. He simply waited until she was ready. When she finally asked him to teach her, he laughed softly and shook his head. He told her he was not a teacher. Teachers gave lessons and assignments and grades. He was just an old man who had learned a few things about life and music along the way. But if she wanted to learn those things too, she was welcome to try. There would be no classroom, no textbooks, no right or wrong answers. There would just be the piano and whatever truth she was brave enough to find. Their lessons happened in strange places. Sometimes they met at the jazz club after closing time, when the chairs were stacked on tables and the only light came from a single lamp on the stage. Sometimes they met at an old church on the other side of town, where a dusty piano sat untouched in the basement. Sometimes they met in the park, sitting on a bench while he described music in words, and she tried to hear what he meant. He never once touched her hands to correct her position. He never once told her she was doing something wrong. Instead, he asked her questions that made her think in ways she never had before. He asked her what color the music was. He asked her what it smelled like, what it tasted like, what memories it brought up from places she had forgotten. He asked her to play the sound of rain falling on a window. He asked her to play the feeling of losing someone you love. He asked her to play the exact moment when night turns into morning. At first, she had no idea what he was talking about. She would sit at the piano, confused and frustrated, her fingers frozen above the keys. But slowly, over weeks and months, something began to shift inside her. She stopped thinking about technique. She stopped worrying about hand position and posture and all the things that Professor had criticized. Instead, she started thinking about feelings. She started thinking about stories. Every time she sat down to play, she would close her eyes and ask herself what she wanted to say. Not what notes to hit, not what chords to use, but what truth she wanted to share with whoever was listening. And when she found that truth, her hands would move on their own, finding melodies she did not know she had inside her. The old man told her she was ready to perform long before she believed it herself. He said music was not meant to be kept in practice rooms and empty churches. It was meant to be shared, to be given away, to connect one human soul to another. She was terrified. The last time she had performed for someone who mattered, she had been told she would never be good enough. But he reminded her that she was not playing for professors anymore. She was playing for people. Real people with real hearts and real pain and real hope. Those people did not care about technique. They cared about feeling something. Her first performance was at an open mic night in a coffee shop downtown. There were maybe 15 people in the audience, most of them more interested in their drinks than the music. She sat down at the small keyboard they had set up in the corner, her hands trembling so badly she could barely find the keys. But then she closed her eyes and thought about the church lady who had first shown her what music could be. She thought about her mother working double shifts to keep them fed. She thought about the 5 years she had lost and the second chance she had been given. And she began to play. When she finished, the coffee shop was silent. For one terrible moment, she thought she had failed again. But then someone in the back started clapping. Then another person. Then another. She opened her eyes and saw people looking at her with something she did not recognize at first. It was not pity. It was not judgment. It was connection. They had felt what she was trying to say. For the first time in her life, she understood what the old man meant. Music was not about being perfect. It was about being true. She started performing everywhere she could. Coffee shops, small bars, street corners, anywhere that would let her play. She did not make much money. Sometimes, she made nothing at all, but she did not care. Every performance taught her something new about herself, about music, about the invisible thread that connects all human beings. Her style was unlike anything people had heard before. It was raw and unpolished, full of unexpected pauses and sudden bursts of emotion. Some people did not understand it, but the ones who did became devoted fans. Word began to spread. A local newspaper wrote a small article about her, calling her the pianist who played like she was telling secrets. A music blogger discovered one of her videos online and shared it with his followers. Slowly, she started getting invited to bigger venues. She played at a jazz festival in a nearby city. She played at a charity event for a children's hospital. She played at a wedding where the bride cried through the entire ceremony. Each performance brought new opportunities, new connections, new reasons to believe that maybe she was on the right path after all. Then came the night that changed everything. She was in the city for a gig that had been canceled at the last minute. She had no money for a hotel, so she decided to take the late train home. While waiting in the subway station, she noticed an old piano sitting against the wall. It was one of those public pianos that cities sometimes put in random places for anyone to play. Most people walked past it without a second glance, but she could not resist. She sat down and started playing, just to pass the time. She did not notice the young man standing nearby with his phone out, recording everything. She did not notice the small crowd that gathered as her music echoed through the underground tunnels. She was lost in her own world, playing a piece she had written about her journey, about the church and Berklee, and the years of silence, and the old blind man who had saved her. When she finished, she looked up and saw dozens of people standing around her, some of them crying, some of them smiling, all of them staring like they had just witnessed something they could not explain. The video went viral within a week. 10 million views, then 20 million, then more than she could count. Comments poured in from all over the world. People said her music had made them feel things they could not put into words. People said they had played the video for their dying parents, their newborn children, their friends going through hard times. She was overwhelmed, terrified, and grateful all at once. She had spent so many years believing she was not good enough, and now millions of strangers were telling her that her music had touched their lives. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. She almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. But something made her click it open. She had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. It was an invitation to perform at Carnegie Hall as part of an emerging artists showcase. Carnegie Hall, the most famous concert venue in the world. The place where legends had stood and played and made history. They wanted her. The girl who had been told she would never play piano. They actually wanted her. She sat at her kitchen table and stared at the screen until the words blurred with tears. Then she picked up her phone and called the old man to tell him the news. The weeks leading up to Carnegie Hall were the longest of her life. She practiced every single day, but not the way she used to practice. She did not drill scales or work on technique or try to fix the flaws that Professor had pointed out years ago. Instead, she played the piece she had written for this moment. It was a composition about her entire journey. Every heartbreak and every triumph woven together into something that felt more like a confession than a performance. The old man listened to her play at once and said nothing for a long time. Then he smiled and told her it was ready. More importantly, he said, she was ready. Her mother insisted on coming to New York for the concert. She had never been on an airplane before, never seen a building taller than 5 stories, never imagined she would watch her daughter perform on the most famous stage in the world. They flew together, holding hands during takeoff, laughing nervously as the city appeared below them like a sea of lights. Her mother kept saying she could not believe this was real. To be honest, she could not believe it either. Part of her still felt like that little girl standing in a church doorway, watching someone else make magic with their hands. The day of the performance arrived faster than she was prepared for. She spent the morning in her hotel room, too nervous to eat, too anxious to sit still. She paced back and forth, running through the piece in her head, feeling her heart pound against her ribs. The old man had wanted to come, but his health would not allow the trip. He had called her that morning and told her to remember one thing: every great performance is just a scar being turned into a song. She wrote those words on her hand so she would not forget. Carnegie Hall was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The building rose up from the street, like a temple, its red brick walls glowing in the afternoon sun. She walked through the stage door and felt history pressing down on her from every direction. The greatest musicians in the world had walked these same hallways. They had stood in these same wings, feeling these same nerves, asking themselves these same questions. Was she good enough? Did she belong here? Would anyone care what she had to say? The backstage area was quiet and cold. She sat in a small dressing room, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. She thought about how far she had come, the church piano with the missing keys, the nights practicing until her fingers bled, the professor who had looked at her like she was nothing, the 5 years of silence, the old man in the jazz club who had given her permission to feel again. All of it had led to this moment. Every single second of pain and joy and fear had brought her here. A stagehand knocked on her door and told her it was time. She stood up on shaking legs and followed him through the maze of hallways until they reached the wings of the stage. She could hear the audience settling into their seats, 2,800 people waiting to hear what she had to offer. She peeked through the curtain and felt her stomach drop. The hall was enormous, with red velvet seats rising up in tiers toward a ceiling painted with gold. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, and there, in the center of the stage, was a Steinway grand piano, black and gleaming under the lights. She almost ran. For one terrible moment, every doubt she had ever felt came rushing back. The professor's voice echoed in her head, telling her she would never play, telling her she was wasting her time, telling her she did not belong in places like this. Her hands started trembling. Her breath came in short gasps. She closed her eyes and gripped the curtain, trying to steady herself. Then she looked down at her hand and saw the words she had written there that morning. Every great performance is just a scar being turned into a song. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The walk to the piano felt like it took forever. The audience applauded politely as she appeared, but she barely heard them. Her entire focus was on that instrument waiting for her. On the bench she lowered herself onto, on the keys that stretched out before her like an old friend, she placed her hands in position and looked out at the sea of faces. Somewhere in that crowd, her mother was watching. Somewhere in that crowd, strangers who had seen her subway video were hoping to feel something again. She owed them the truth. She owed herself the truth. She began to play. The first notes were soft, hesitant, like footsteps in fresh snow. They told the story of a little girl who fell in love with music in a rundown church. Then the melody grew stronger, more confident, as she played the part about dreams and determination and believing in something bigger than yourself. The middle section was dark and heavy, full of dissonance and pain. It was the part about Berklee, about the professor, about the years she had spent hiding from her own gift. She felt tears streaming down her face as she played, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Then the music shifted again. It became lighter, more hopeful, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. This was the part about the old man, about the jazz club, about learning that technique was just a cage and emotion was the key. The notes danced and swirled, building towards something bigger, something she had never been able to put into words, but had always felt deep in her bones. And finally, the piece reached its climax. a triumphant cascade of chords that said everything she had ever wanted to say. I am here. I made it. I am enough. When the last note faded into silence, she sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes closed. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Just the sound of her own breathing in that enormous hall. Then someone stood up. Then another person. Then another. And suddenly the entire audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering and crying, filling Carnegie Hall with a sound she had never heard directed at her before. It was the sound of 2,800 people telling her that she mattered. She finally opened her eyes and looked out at the standing ovation. And that was when she saw him. Front row, center seat. The professor from Berklee. The man who had told her she would never play piano. He was older now. His hair completely gray. His face lined with years she had not witnessed. But she recognized him instantly. And he was standing too. He was standing and clapping, and there were tears running down his cheeks. After the concert, she found him waiting backstage. He looked smaller than she remembered, less intimidating, almost fragile. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he cleared his throat and said two words she never expected to hear from him. I was wrong. His voice cracked as he continued. He said he had taught notes his entire career. Scales and theory and proper hand position. But she had learned something he never could have taught her. She had learned music. Real music. The kind that comes from living and hurting and surviving. She did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to be angry, to remind him of how much pain his words had caused, how many years she had lost because of 4 minutes in an assessment room. But looking at him now, she realized that anger had no place in this moment. He had been wrong about her, but his being wrong had sent her on a journey that made her who she was. Without his rejection, she never would have found the old man. She never would have learned to play from her scars. She never would have become the musician standing in this hallway. So she smiled. She reached out and shook his hand. And then she let go. Not just of his hand, but of everything. The doubt, the fear, the voice that had lived in her head for so long, telling her she was not good enough. She let it all go. Because she had finally proven something to herself. Not to him, not to the audience, not to anyone else. To herself. She could play piano. She always could. She just needed to learn that the music was never in her hands. It was in her heart.